He thought he inherited nothing but an old cabin. But when his dogs started barking near the rocks, they found a secret that had been buried for decades. Watch what happened next, and see what was really hidden in the mountains. Subscribe so you never miss the next story, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The road into the mountains narrowed with every mile, curling through pine and granite, until the world behind Tom seemed to dissolve into mist. His old truck climbed slowly, its tires crunching over frost and loose stone. The air grew colder as the elevation rose, and with it came that familiar stillness he had missed all winter, a silence that seemed to breathe from the forest itself. Beside him, his black German shepherd, Rain, sat alert in the passenger seat, nose close to the cracked window, eyes fixed on the shifting line of trees ahead. It had been 2 months since they had last made the trip to the cabin, and though the snow had begun to thin along the lower ridges, up here, the drift still clung to the shaded slopes, white and silent as ash. Tom's hands rested steady on the wheel. He had driven this road since boyhood, first in his father's truck, later in his uncle's, and now in his own battered vehicle that smelled of oil, leather, and pine sap. The mountain had a rhythm he understood better than conversation. Every turn, every sound of gravel beneath the tires was a memory of a man who had chosen solitude over company and truth over comfort. When the cabin finally appeared between the trees, it was as though it had grown from the rock itself. The roof sagged slightly under years of snow, and the logs had darkened with weather, but it still stood, stubborn as ever, a small refuge pressed against the slope of the hill. Tom parked the truck beside the old woodpile and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was immense. For a moment, he simply sat there, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the faint rustle of branches overhead. Rain whined softly, impatient to be out. Tom smiled, reached for his coat, and stepped into the cold. The air bit at his face, crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of resin and damp earth. He let the dog run ahead, its dark shape moving easily across the snow, and walked to the porch. The padlock on the door was exactly as he had left it in autumn. The key turned with effort. The hinges groaned, and the smell of stale air greeted him, a mix of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like time itself left standing too long. He built a small fire in the stone hearth, fed it pine kindling, and watched as the first thin flames caught and began to dance across the blackened logs. The warmth spread slowly through the room, chasing away the months of cold that had settled into the walls. He unpacked methodically. Food, tools, a lantern, ammunition, and the folded letter that had brought him back sooner than planned. It had arrived 2 weeks earlier, printed on official paper from the county office. The words were simple confirmation of inheritance, property transfer finalized. His uncle had been gone nearly a year, but bureaucracy was slower than grief. The letter also mentioned something Tom had never known about, an additional parcel of land adjoining the cabin, registered decades ago under the old man's name. He had thought he knew every inch of this mountain, but the attached map suggested otherwise. There was a red line drawn beyond the ridge behind the cabin, leading toward a mark labeled only Survey Site Restricted Access. The note beside it was brief and cryptic. Structure present entry sealed. At first he had dismissed it as a clerical error, another left over from his uncle's years as a forestry warden. But something about the precision of the mark had stayed with him. His uncle had never been careless. Every measurement, every note in the margins of his maps had purpose. That knowledge was what had drawn Tom back here now, long before spring had fully arrived. By afternoon, the cabin was warm again, the fire steady, and the kettle hissing softly. Rain lay near the hearth, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Outside, the sky had turned the pale silver of late winter, and wind whispered down the ridge in slow breaths. Tom sat at the table with the letter spread before him, tracing the map's red line with a calloused finger. The slope behind the cabin was steep, a tangle of spruce and shale that gave way to cliffs farther up. If a structure existed there, it would have to be something built into the rock itself, perhaps an old survey station or mine shaft from decades past. He tried to recall stories his uncle used to tell on quiet evenings, about hidden caves where miners once stored dynamite, about cold streams running beneath the mountain, about the sound of wind moving through the hollows like a voice. At the time, Tom had thought they were only tales meant to fill silence. Now they felt like warnings. The next morning broke clear and brittle. Frost rimed the porch boards, and the trees glittered as though dusted with glass. Tom loaded a pack with rope, a flashlight, a small crowbar, and a thermos of coffee. Rain trotted at his heel, tail high, eager for the walk. They started up the slope behind the cabin, following a narrow deer path that wound through thick undergrowth. The climb was steep, and the ground soft beneath patches of ice. The sound of their steps was the only movement in the still air. Half an hour passed before the forest began to thin, opening to a small plateau where the wind cut sharper. From there, Tom could see across the valley the endless waves of pine stretching toward the horizon, each ridge fading into mist. He paused to catch his breath, the map open in one hand. The red mark was close now, less than a quarter-mile ahead, near the base of a rocky outcrop that rose like a wall from the slope. Rain moved ahead suddenly, nose to the ground, body tense. The dog let out a short bark, then another, pacing in circles near a patch of snow-darkened earth. Tom followed quickly, his boots crunching over frozen leaves. What he saw stopped him. Between two boulders, half hidden by roots and moss, was a gap in the rock barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Cold air drifted out of it, smelling faintly of mineral and damp stone. He crouched, brushed away the leaves, and saw the edge of something metallic beneath the corner of a rusted frame welded into the stone. The light caught it for an instant, dull and red like old blood. A door, a hidden entrance buried under years of decay. He stood slowly, looking around. The forest was silent, the trees unmoving, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. His uncle had been a man of secrets, but this was something deliberate. Tom tested the edge of the door with the crowbar. The metal groaned but held firm. The hinges were fused with rust, the seam sealed with earth. He pried again, harder this time, until a crack appeared and a puff of cold, stale air burst outward. Rain growled softly, ears flat, pacing behind him. The sound of metal yielding echoed faintly through the rock like a sigh. He waited, listening, then pushed the crowbar deeper. With one final shove, the door gave way, swinging inward with a shriek of protest. A wave of darkness rolled out, dense, cold, untouched. Tom switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the black, revealing stone wall slick with moisture and a narrow tunnel leading down at a gentle angle. The air smelled of iron and dust. He hesitated at the threshold. A man alone in the mountains learns to listen to instincts, and every instinct in him whispered caution. But curiosity was stronger. He clipped the flashlight to his jacket and stepped inside. The ground beneath his boots was uneven, scattered with loose rock. Rain followed close, silent now, the soft pad of his paws echoing faintly off the walls. After a few yards, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. The light fell across what at first looked like a pile of debris, old boards, barrels, and rusted tools. But then Tom saw the straight lines, the deliberate angles of something manufactured. A shipping container. Half buried in the stone, its sides mottled with corrosion, its roof collapsed inward where rock had fallen. It looked as though the mountain had tried to swallow it whole. He approached slowly, running a gloved hand along the metal. The same dull red color, the same construction as those used decades ago for transport. How it had been brought here, through the forest and into the heart of the mountain, was a mystery in itself. He found the latch at the front rusted, bent, but still locked. The padlock was fused solid. Rain sniffed the ground near the base, whining softly, then began to paw at a spot near the corner where the earth seemed looser. Tom crouched beside him, brushing away dirt until a faint imprint of letters appeared on the metal surface. They were almost gone, erased by time, but he could still make out the initials carved deep into the steel. JG, his uncle's hand. For a long moment he said nothing, only stood there, listening to the sound of his own breathing. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. He pried at the lock until it broke with a dull crack. The door resisted, then creaked open a few inches. A gust of stale, metallic air swept out, thick with dust and oil. He waited for the haze to settle before shining the flashlight inside. The beam revealed chaos heaps of old machinery, cables, broken furniture, the remnants of a life dismantled and hidden. It reminded him of a storm's aftermath, as if everything once useful had been gathered and left here to decay. Yet even in the disorder, there was a strange order. Boxes stacked deliberately, tools arranged as though someone meant to return. He stepped inside, the echo of his boots loud in the confined space. Rain stayed by the entrance, uneasy. The beam of light swept across shelves lined with jars, cans, and rolled maps sealed in glass tubes. Dust lay thick over everything. At the far end of the container stood a workbench, covered with papers pinned under stones. Tom brushed them off carefully. The ink had faded, but he recognized the handwriting immediately. Tight, deliberate, unmistakable. His uncle's. He felt a tightening in his chest, the same mixture of awe and dread that comes when the past reaches into the present. The papers were field reports, notes on forest conditions, coordinates, lists of tree species, but among them were entries that didn't belong to any official survey. Unauthorized clearing East Ridge. Truck seen at night. Contacted office, no response. Line after line of quiet accusation. The writing grew more urgent near the bottom of the page. Evidence stored. Secure location. Then, beneath it, a single phrase circled twice. They will come for me. Tom stepped back, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The silence pressed close, broken only by the slow drip of water from the ceiling. He looked around again, realizing that what he had found was not a storage space, but a vault, a place built to hide something worth hiding. Behind him, Rain barked once, sharp and sudden. The sound echoed through the cave like a warning. Tom turned toward the entrance, listening, but heard nothing else. Only the mountain breathing, slow and deep. He took one last look at the papers, folded them carefully, and slipped them into his pack. Then he closed the container door and began the slow climb back toward daylight. When they emerged from the cave, the sun was already sinking behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the snow. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of shifting branches. Tom paused at the entrance, looking back at the dark mouth of the tunnel. Somewhere behind that wall of rock lay the rest of the truth his uncle had buried, but not tonight. He needed time to think, to understand what he had stumbled into. As he and Rain made their way down the slope, the first flakes of new snow began to fall, drifting slowly through the fading light. By the time they reached the cabin, darkness had settled fully over the valley. He built another fire, fed the dog, and sat at the table staring at the folded papers. The handwriting stared back at him like a ghost. He knew, even then, that sleep would not come easily. The mountain was whispering again, and he had opened a door that would not close. The morning light filtered weakly through the frost-coated window panes of the cabin, spreading a pale glow across the rough wooden floor. Tom sat at the table with his coffee, the steam rising in slow spirals, his eyes fixed on the folded pages before him. The fire from the night before had dwindled to ash, and the air carried a chill that even the thick wool blanket over his shoulders couldn't push away. The memory of the cave clung to him, its smell of iron and stone, the echo of his own footsteps, the sharp crack of rusted hinges giving way. He could still see the outline of the container in his mind, half swallowed by the mountain, and the letters carved into its side. J.G., his uncle's initials. He'd found something meant to be hidden, something that had slept untouched for years, and though he didn't yet understand what it was, he knew that what he had uncovered was more than remnants of the past. It felt like a message meant for him alone. Rain lay by the hearth, the dog's head resting on his paws, but his eyes wide open, watching Tom's every movement. The animal had been uneasy since their return, lifting his head at every sound of wind through the trees or branch scraping against the wall. Tom felt it too, the tension of a place that had been disturbed. He poured another cup of coffee, the bitter scent grounding him in the present, and unfolded the papers once more. His uncle's handwriting ran across the pages in tight, deliberate lines. The ink faded, but still clear enough to read. It wasn't a diary in the ordinary sense. It was more like a record, a ledger of places, dates, and short notes, each written with the precision of a man used to documentation. Inspection, North Ridge, unauthorized clearing. Night movement near Old Survey Road. Report filed, no action taken. Each entry was followed by coordinates, and some had been marked with a faint circle, as though to emphasize what mattered most. As he read deeper, the notes grew darker. The tone shifted from routine to caution. Told not to return to site, orders unclear, keeping evidence. Then, at the bottom of one page, a sentence written in hurried scrawl, almost pressed through the paper. If anything happens, they'll look for me first. Tom leaned back, exhaling slowly. He could almost see his uncle hunched over that same page years ago, his lantern flickering against the metal walls of the cave, his breath visible in the cold air. He must have known the risk. He must have known that some truths couldn't be spoken out loud. Tom closed the notebook and rubbed his hands together. The skin cracked from years of cold work. There was more in that cave, he was sure of it. The container was too large, the arrangement too deliberate for the scattered papers he had taken. His uncle had built that place for a reason, and if the notes spoke truth, whatever he'd hidden was tied to something larger than just a lifetime of solitude. It had been nearly midday when he packed his bag again. Lantern, crowbar, a rope, spare batteries. Rain barked once as if to protest, but when Tom opened the door, the dog trotted ahead into the snow, his dark shape cutting a path through the pale light. The climb back to the ridge felt steeper that day. The snow had hardened overnight, crunching under his boots, and the wind had turned sharp enough to sting. Clouds gathered above the peaks, low and heavy, carrying the promise of another storm. Tom didn't mind. He preferred the mountain, that way, wild, unforgiving, honest. The kind of place where truth had no audience but the wind. When they reached the mouth of the cave, the air around it felt colder than before, as though the darkness itself exhaled frost. Tom crouched, checking the door he had pried open yesterday. It hung slightly ajar, the rusted hinges still strained from the force. He ran his hand along the frame. The metal was colder than the rock. He switched on his flashlight and ducked inside. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing the same rough tunnel sloping downward into silence. Each step echoed off the walls in dull thuds, the sound swallowed quickly by depth. The air grew thicker, laced with moisture and decay. Rain followed close behind, nails clicking faintly on stone. When the tunnel opened into the main chamber, Tom stopped. Everything was as he had left it. The scattered tools, the stacks of boxes, the workbench with papers pinned beneath a stone. But now the air felt heavier, the stillness more pronounced. He approached the workbench, brushing dust from the surface. Beneath the pages he'd seen before was something else, a small tin box wrapped in wax paper. He unwrapped it carefully, the paper tearing with a faint crackle, and found a bundle of photographs inside. Most were black and white, grainy with age. They showed stretches of forest, felled trees piled like bones, trucks lined along makeshift roads. On the back of one, his uncle had written in thin block letters, "Unauthorized Zone East Ridge." Another photo showed men in hard hats standing beside heavy machinery. In the corner of the image, half hidden by shadow, was a government vehicle marked with the forestry emblem. Tom flipped through more pictures clearings, cut logs stamped with serial numbers, documents spread across tables. These weren't keepsakes. They were proof. His uncle had documented something illegal, something large-scale. And then, beneath the photographs, Tom found another envelope yellowed, unsealed, with a single word written across the front in ink that had bled with time. If found. Inside was a folded letter, written in the same precise hand. If you are reading this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. They'll call me mad, or they'll call me missing. But the truth will be buried here until someone has the courage to dig it out. I have seen what they've done to the forest, to the people who tried to stop it. Keep it safe. The evidence is deeper than this room. Tom's pulse quickened as he looked around the chamber. Deeper. He lifted the flashlight and swept it along the far wall, where the rock met the metal casing of the container. One section looked different, flatter, cleaner, as though recently disturbed when everything else had long been coated in dust. He walked closer, running his fingers over the surface. A faint outline formed under his touch, square and deliberate. Another door, smaller, almost invisible. He struck the crowbar into the edge and pulled. The metal resisted, then groaned open with a screech that echoed through the stone. Beyond it was another space, a narrow corridor leading deeper into the mountain. Rain growled softly, but Tom whispered a calm word and stepped through. The floor was uneven, the air heavier with each step. The beam of the flashlight flickered against walls, lined with old shelves and crates. The smell of oil and wood filled the space. He realized then that this was no accident. His uncle had built an archive underground, a place to hide what no one else dared to see. On one shelf lay stacks of bound folders marked with faded tags. Permits, contracts, surveys. On another, a row of metal canisters sealed tight. He picked up one folder and opened it. Inside were typed documents with official seals, authorizations for timber harvesting in restricted zones, all signed by the same names. Only the signatures weren't real. His uncle had marked each one with red ink, forged. Tom sat back on his heels, the weight of understanding pressing down on him. His uncle had uncovered a conspiracy that reached far beyond the forest, a network of companies and officials profiting from illegal deforestation, falsifying documents, and silencing anyone who got in the way. No wonder he had disappeared. No wonder the man had lived his final years alone, surrounded by suspicion and fear. He had been guarding the truth, waiting for someone to find it when he no longer could. Rain's sudden bark jolted Tom from thought. The dog stood near the entrance of the corridor, ears pricked, staring toward the tunnel that led back outside. Tom turned off the flashlight and listened. At first, there was only silence, the kind that made the air itself seem to hold still. Then came a sound distant, but unmistakable, the crunch of snow, the echo of footsteps, faint yet deliberate. Someone was near the cave. He waited, barely breathing, counting the seconds between each sound. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The forest above them fell silent again. He stayed where he was for a long minute, listening, before turning the light back on. The beam wavered slightly as his hand trembled. He gathered the nearest folder and slipped it into his pack, then carefully replaced the rest. If someone had found their way this far into the mountains, it could only mean one thing. Someone else knew what was buried here. He backed through the narrow passage, sealing the inner door behind him as best he could. By the time he reached the surface, the daylight had already begun to fade. Snow had started to fall, heavy now, thick flakes swirling in the wind. Tom scanned the trees, but saw no movement. The air was still. Too still. He made his way down the slope, boots slipping on the fresh snow, the dog close beside him. When they reached the cabin, the storm had grown fierce. The windows rattled in their frames, and wind moaned down the chimney. He bolted the door, lit the lamps, and set the documents on the table. Rain paced near the window, tail low, ears twitching. Outside, the forest was a blur of white. He tried to calm himself with routine drying his gloves, feeding the dog, but every creak of the timbers felt like a warning. Later that night, long after he had banked the fire and the storm began to fade, a noise woke him. A faint metallic clang, far off, muffled by snow and distance. He sat up, listening. Another sound followed, softer this time, almost like something closing. The cave. He was sure of it. Someone had been there. He reached for the rifle that leaned against the wall and stood by the window, watching the darkness beyond the porch. Nothing moved. Only the wind through the trees. Still, he didn't sleep. Not until dawn began to thin the blackness and the first light crept across the floor. When morning came, he found fresh tracks in the snow near the truck, too large for any animal, too straight to be accidental. They led from the road toward the ridge and then vanished into the woods. He followed them a short distance before they disappeared in the drifts. Whoever had been there had known the terrain. Tom returned to the cabin, his jaw set. The papers on the table looked almost ordinary now, their edges curling slightly from the heat. But he knew better. They were dangerous, both to those they exposed, and to him. His uncle had trusted the mountain to guard the truth. Now that burden had shifted to him. That evening, as he sat by the fire with the documents spread before him, Tom made a decision. He would not run, and he would not hide. Whatever was buried in that mountain had already claimed one life. It would not claim another in silence. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the steam rising in the quiet air, and stared into the flames until they blurred. Outside, the snow fell softly, muffling the world in white. Deep within the cave, the mountain held its breath again, waiting for what would come next. The forest had kept its secret long enough. The storm returned before nightfall, sweeping down from the ridge with a force that rattled the shutters and howled through the eaves. Snow whipped across the valley, erasing the tracks that had marked the road only hours earlier. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its glow flickering across the wooden walls. Tom sat in silence, the documents spread across the table once again, each page a fragment of a truth that had been buried for decades. The weight of it pressed on him harder than the storm outside. He had never imagined himself the sort of man who would stand at the center of something larger than his own quiet life. But now the choice was upon him, clear and immovable. He could keep the secret, and the world would go on unchanged. Or he could expose it and risk becoming another ghost in the mountain's long memory. Rain stirred near the door, his head lifting at the sound of wind hitting the roof. The dog had been restless all day, pacing between the window and the hearth, tail flicking with unease. Tom reached down to calm him, feeling the tremor beneath the animal's coat. "Easy, boy," he said softly, though his own voice sounded strange in the hush. He rose, checked the rifle by the wall, and added another log to the fire. The flames rose reluctantly, spreading warmth that didn't quite reach the edges of the room. The papers on the table fluttered slightly, as if stirred by an unseen breath. He gathered them into stacks and tied them with cord, then slid them into the metal case he'd found in the cave. The case was heavy, its lid dented, the paint flaking in dull curls. When it shut, the sound was final, like the closing of a chapter that had waited too long to be read. By midnight, the storm had quieted to a whisper. Snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, blanketing the forest in white. Tom couldn't sleep. He dressed, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The air was sharp enough to burn his lungs, the silence absolute. Only the faint crack of settling ice broke the stillness. He stood on the porch, watching the tree line. The mountains were ghosts now, their shapes lost in the white gloom. Yet even in the quiet, he felt the weight of eyes upon him. The sense of being watched had followed him for days, growing stronger with each discovery. He thought of the tracks near the truck, of the clang of metal in the night. Whoever had been up there knew what he had found, and they would come back for it. When dawn broke, the sky was a sheet of pale gray. Tom brewed coffee, fed the dog, and packed the essentials into his rucksack maps. Food, the metal case wrapped in oilcloth. The decision had formed overnight, clear and steady. He would take the documents to town, to someone who could make them matter. He couldn't trust the local sheriff's office. His uncle's notes had made that clear. The nearest newspaper was 2 towns over, a 3-hour drive on a good day, longer in snow. But he would make it. He had to. Before leaving, he wrote a short note and pinned it to the cabin door. "If I don't return, look in the mountain." It wasn't meant for anyone in particular, just a message for whatever might remain after him. The truck started reluctantly, its engine coughing before catching. The tires cut deep tracks through the snow as it crawled down the narrow road. Rain sat in the passenger seat, head pressed to the window, ears twitching at every sound. The forest blurred past in shades of white and gray. For the first few miles, the drive was uneventful, the only movement the steady fall of snow. But near the base of the ridge, Tom caught sight of something in the rearview mirror, a pair of headlights cresting the hill behind him. Too far to identify, but moving fast, too fast for the icy road. His grip tightened on the wheel. He didn't slow down. The lights drew closer as the road narrowed into a single lane between frozen embankments. There was no shoulder, no room to turn. The truck behind him gained steadily until its shape emerged from the fog. A dark SUV, newer than anything locals drove, its headlights cutting through the snow like blades. Tom felt a surge of cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He pressed the accelerator, but the truck's old engine groaned in protest. The road curved sharply ahead, following the edge of a steep ravine. He took the turn fast, the tires skidding, snow spraying up in sheets. Behind him, the SUV fishtailed, then straightened, its lights flaring brighter. It was closing the distance. The chase lasted minutes that felt like hours. When the road forked, Tom veered onto the old logging trail, a narrow path half buried in snow. Branches clawed at the windshield, and the truck lurched over frozen ruts. The SUV followed at first, then slowed, its bulk too heavy for the uneven ground. Tom pushed forward until the trail ended at the frozen stream below the valley. He cut the engine. The silence returned, thick and absolute. The other vehicle was gone, at least for now. He waited, listening, every muscle tense. Only the sound of his own breath filled the cab. After a long moment, he exhaled and reached for the thermos. The coffee had gone cold, but it steadied him. He stayed there until afternoon, hidden beneath the skeletal branches of the pines, before deciding it was safe to move. Instead of continuing toward town, he turned the truck toward the western ridge, where the old fire road climbed to a lookout point few remembered. If someone was tracking him, the direct route was suicide. He would find another way to get the documents into the right hands. He knew a ranger outpost beyond the ridge, abandoned but still on record. The radio there might still work, and from that signal, he could reach beyond the county. It was a long shot, but it was something. The climb was brutal. The truck slid more than once, wheels spinning on the icy incline. The dog braced itself against the seat, silent except for the occasional low whine. By the time they reached the top, the light had begun to fade again, the sky turning to slate. The outpost stood at the edge of the cliff, a small wooden structure half collapsed under snow. Tom parked beside it and stepped out, the wind cutting across the ridge with a sound like distant voices. The door to the outpost hung loose on one hinge. Inside, the air smelled of mold and dust. The radio equipment sat on a table against the wall, coated in a film of frost. He wiped it clean, fingers numb, and turned the knobs. Nothing. Only static. He tried again, adjusting the frequency, tapping the side of the unit. A faint crackle broke the silence, then a voice distant, distorted, but real. "Station 7, come in. Repeat, Station 7. The line faded, then returned stronger. Tom leaned close to the microphone. "This is Tom Gray, Northern Ridge," he said, his voice rough with cold and exhaustion. "I have documents evidence of illegal activity in the protected zone. Request immediate contact." Static filled the air again, then silence. He waited, breath held, until the speaker crackled once more. "Copy that, Northern Ridge. Stay put. Help is on the way." The transmission cut out. Relief came slow, cautious. He didn't know who was on the other end, or how long they would take, but it was enough to know the message had gone through. He looked at Rain, who wagged his tail weakly and managed a smile. "We're not alone anymore, boy," he whispered. Outside, the wind howled louder, and snow began to fall again, erasing all signs of their path. Night came quickly, swallowing the mountains in black. The outpost creaked under the weight of snow. Tom fed the fire in the small stove and wrapped himself in his coat, the metal case resting beside him. He thought of his uncle, alone in this same wilderness, gathering evidence, knowing what it would cost him. The same courage that had driven the old man now pulsed faintly in Tom's chest. He wasn't a hero. He was just tired of silence. As the fire burned low, he drifted into a light sleep, the storm outside raging like a living thing. He woke to the sound of engines. At first, he thought it was the wind again, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Tires on frozen ground, approaching fast. He grabbed the rifle, heart pounding. Through the crack in the window, he saw headlights cutting through the storm. 2 vehicles this time, not the Rangers. The first SUV stopped a few yards from the outpost. The second idled behind it. Doors opened. Figures stepped out, dark shapes moving through the snow. There were no words, only the crunch of boots and the faint metallic click of a weapon being cocked. Rain growled low, teeth bared. Tom backed away from the window and moved toward the stove. He kicked it hard, sending sparks across the floor, then turned the lantern off. Darkness swallowed the room. The first bullet shattered the window. Glass sprayed across the floor. Tom dropped to his knees, returning fire once, twice, the sound deafening in the confined space. The men outside shouted, their voices carried away by the wind. Another shot tore through the wall, splintering the wood inches from his head. Rain lunged toward the door, barking furiously. Tom shouted for him to stay back, but the dog wouldn't listen. The door burst open in a rush of cold air, and for an instant, chaos filled the room. Snow, smoke, movement. Tom fired again. A figure fell. Another retreated. The SUV engines roared. Then, silence. When it was over, Tom sat on the floor, breathing hard, the rifle still in his hands. The wind howled through the shattered window. Rain limped back inside, muzzle streaked with blood, but alive. Tom dropped the rifle and reached for him, hands shaking. "It's over," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Outside, one of the vehicles was gone, the other burning faintly, flames flickering low against the snow. He stood there for a long time, staring at the fire, the realization slowly settling in. They had come for what he carried, and they would not stop until it was gone. By dawn, the storm had passed. Smoke rose in thin curls from the wreckage below the ridge. Tom loaded the documents into the truck, every movement deliberate. The radio crackled again, faint but clear. "Northern Ridge, this is Federal Response Team. We're en route. Do you copy?" He pressed the transmitter. "Copy," he said, his voice hoarse. "You'd better hurry." Then he climbed into the truck, the dog beside him, and started the engine. The path down the ridge was narrow, half buried in snow, but he took it slow, steady, never once looking back. When the rescue convoy met him halfway down the mountain, he saw the emblems on their doors, federal seals, not local. Men in heavy coats approached, careful, professional. One of them saluted briefly before opening the truck bed and lifting the case. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. Tom didn't answer. He only nodded, exhausted beyond words. They escorted him down the rest of the way. By evening, the mountain was behind him, shrinking into the haze. The documents were gone, handed over, out of his hands at last. The weight of them lifted, leaving something hollow in its place. In the days that followed, there would be headlines, investigations, resignations. His uncle's name would appear again, this time not as a rumor or a missing person, but as a man who had tried to protect what others destroyed. Weeks later, Tom returned to the cabin. The snow had melted, leaving the ground soft and alive with the first shoots of spring. He repaired the broken window, patched the bullet holes, and rebuilt the firewood shed that the storm had torn apart. The mountain felt different now, quieter, but not empty. At dusk, he walked up to the ridge where the cave lay hidden. The entrance was still there, half covered with moss and thawing earth. He crouched beside it, resting his hand on the cold stone. "It's done," he murmured. The forest answered in its own way, with a slow sigh of wind through the pines. Rain barked once, breaking the silence. Tom smiled faintly and turned back toward home. The sun was sinking behind the peaks, washing the valley in gold. The old cabin waited, smoke curling gently from its chimney. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of solitude lift, replaced by something quieter and deeper. Peace. His uncle's secret had become his legacy, and the truth, once buried, now belonged to the light. That night, as he sat by the fire with the dog at his feet, Tom opened the last of the notebooks. On the final page, in faded ink, was a single line written years ago. "If the forest speaks again, listen." He closed the book and listened. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the sound of life returning. It was enough. If this story kept you watching till the end, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you. There are more stories that will stay with you long after they end. And don't forget to share this video with someone who still believes that every truth deserves to be found.